Cesar Millan has become famous as the dog whisperer, the man who can tame the most untrainable dogs. But now he's being sued, accused of having a pit bull that bit humans and even killed Queen Latifah's dog.
For years, the internet has been flooded with shocking claims that Cesar Millan, the world-famous dog whisperer, was arrested and sentenced to life. Some insist his career was destroyed by scandal. Others believe he was finally brought down by years of controversy. But what really happened? To truly understand that, we must separate viral fiction from documented fact, uncover the controversies that nearly consumed him, and follow a story filled with unexpected twists, personal tragedy, and warfare. When science turned against television's biggest dog trainer. As dog whisperer became a global phenomenon, a growing number of animal behavior specialists believed one of the world's most influential television personalities was popularizing ideas that modern behavioral science had been moving away from for years. Throughout his television career, Millan argued that dogs thrive under calm, confident leadership, and that many behavioral problems emerge when owners unknowingly create instability inside the home. His signature phrases, including calm assertive energy and pack leader, became instantly recognizable across the globe. Rather than focusing primarily on treats or verbal commands, Millan often relied on body language, spatial control, leash guidance, and carefully timed corrections to interrupt unwanted behavior. To audiences watching dramatic before and after transformations, the approach appeared logical. The dogs often seemed calmer, the owners regained confidence, and the results looked almost immediate. The problem, critics argued, wasn't necessarily whether those methods could produce short-term results. It was the scientific explanation behind them. Many of the concepts associated with dominance training trace back to wolf research conducted between the 1940s and 1970s, when researchers observed unrelated wolves living together inside artificial enclosures. Those captive animals frequently competed for status, giving rise to the now famous image of the dominant alpha wolf controlling the rest of the pack. But you see, wildlife biologist Dr. L. David Meck, whose own research had helped popularize the alpha concept decades earlier, corrected his views. He spent years observing wild wolf populations and saw that natural packs usually function as family groups led by breeding parents rather than unrelated wolves constantly fighting for dominance. He later discouraged people from casually using the term alpha wolf, arguing that it created a misleading picture of wolf behavior. Researchers also emphasized another critical point that often disappeared from public discussions. Domestic dogs are not simply tame wolves. Thousands of years of domestication have significantly altered their social behavior, making direct comparisons far less reliable than many earlier training philosophies assumed. As those findings gained wider acceptance, criticism of dog whisperer intensified. Veterinary behaviorists questioned several techniques that occasionally appeared on the program, including leash corrections, physical restraint, flooding, alpha rolls, and other methods designed to interrupt behavior through direct intervention. Their concern was that such approaches might work, but they may also increase fear, stress, or defensive aggression in certain dogs. Organizations such as the American Veterinary Society of Animal Behavior published position statements arguing that dominance theory should not serve as the primary explanation for common behavior problems. Instead, they pointed toward reward-based training, environmental management, and positive reinforcement as approaches supported by a growing body of scientific research. Soon, the debate became impossible to ignore. Dr. Nicholas Dodman, who led the Animal Behavior Clinic at Tufts University's Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine, openly criticized Millan's philosophy, arguing that it conflicted with decades of advances in behavioral science. Writer and animal behavior commentator Mark Derr raised similar concerns in national publications, questioning both the scientific foundation of the show and the message it sent to millions of viewers. Then, in 2006, the American Humane Association publicly urged the National Geographic Channel to stop broadcasting Dog Whisperer, describing several training methods featured on the series as outdated and potentially inhumane. For many experts, the greatest risk wasn't Millan himself. It was what happened after the credits rolled. A single television episode condensed hours, and sometimes days, of rehabilitation into less than an hour of entertainment. Viewers rarely saw the preparation, safety precautions, follow-up sessions, or the experience required to work with genuinely dangerous animals. Critics worried that inexperienced owners would imitate physical corrections without understanding the subtle timing, body language, or behavioral assessment behind them. A technique performed by a seasoned professional under controlled conditions could produce very different and sometimes dangerous results when copied at home. Millan rejected the idea that his methods were reckless. He repeatedly argued that many of the dogs featured on his programs weren't ordinary pets with minor obedience issues. According to him, they were animals facing abandonment, euthanasia, or a history of serious attack. In those situations, he believed conventional training advice often arrived too late. The headlines never stopped. Following the condemnation of the American Humane Association, Dog Whisperer remained on the air for another 6 years, and, somewhat unexpectedly, relations between Millan and the organization later became less confrontational. Millan even invited representatives to observe filming, suggesting that despite their continued disagreements, both sides were willing to engage directly. Several years later, another incident reignited the debate, this time across the Atlantic. During a 2012 episode of British presenter Alan Titchmarsh's ITV program, viewers were shown footage that appeared to capture Millan striking a Labrador retriever during a training session. The clip spread rapidly, triggering accusations that he had crossed the line into unnecessary force. Millan firmly rejected that interpretation, insisting the movement was a brief corrective touch rather than a punch, and arguing that the footage lacked the surrounding context. The scrutiny wasn't limited to television. As Millan's profile grew, legal disputes involving businesses connected to his training operations also began making headlines. Some lawsuits alleged that dogs associated with his facilities had caused injuries or had themselves been harmed. Of course, filing a lawsuit does not prove liability, and several cases ended without a court finding that Millan had committed wrongdoing. Even so, every new legal filing generated fresh news coverage, ensuring that controversy remained closely attached to his name regardless of the eventual outcome. Perhaps the most widely publicized legal battle emerged long after Dog Whisperer had already left the air. In 2021, former gymnast Lydia Mattis sued Millan, alleging that his pit bull, Junior, attacked her and caused life-changing injuries that ended her gymnastics career. The lawsuit also claimed that Junior had previously killed one of actress Queen Latifah's dogs and that the incident had been concealed. Millan denied the allegation involving Queen Latifah's dog and disputed key aspects of the lawsuit. The case was ultimately settled outside of court. Even without a courtroom verdict, the allegations generated enormous publicity because they challenged the image Millan had spent years building. Then another televised incident fueled fresh criticism. During the production of Cesar 911, an aggressive French bulldog being rehabilitated chased and bit a pet pig on the ear while cameras were recording. The incident prompted an investigation by Los Angeles County Animal Cruelty authorities, who reviewed video recordings, veterinary evidence, and witness accounts. After completing that review, investigators declined to file criminal charges, concluding there was insufficient evidence to support an animal cruelty case. But you see, the profession itself was also changing. As the 21st century progressed, reward-based training gained increasing support from behavioral research and veterinary organizations. Television trainer Victoria Stilwell, host of It's Me or the Dog, became one of the most recognizable advocates of positive reinforcement, offering viewers a philosophy that contrasted sharply with Millan's emphasis on corrections and leadership. Veterinary behaviorists increasingly encouraged owners to focus on rewards, environmental management, and scientifically tested learning principles rather than confrontational techniques. None of these events, by themselves, explains why Dog Whisperer eventually disappeared from television. Millan had simply become one of the most divisive figures in the industry. And it's ironic, considering how he was the one who helped popularize it in the first place. But then, things took a turn for the worse. How crossing a border changed everything. Years before television turned him into a household name, Cesar Millan was an unknown young man growing up in the Mexican state of Sinaloa. Born on August 27, 1969, he spent much of his childhood in the small rural community of Ixpalino, where his grandfather's farm became his first classroom. Surrounded by livestock, working animals, and roaming dogs, he developed an unusual fascination with how animals interacted. Relatives eventually gave him the nickname El Perrero, or the dog herder. Reflecting later on those days, he said that he could see that the dogs were constantly communicating through posture, movement, and timing. He learned to read those silent signals, but ambition can outgrow its surroundings. As Cesar got older, he became convinced that his future wasn't on a farm in rural Mexico. He dreamed of working with the world's best dog trainers, many of whom he believed were in California, particularly around Hollywood, where trainers supplied animals for film and television. So, in the early 1990s, still barely into his 20s, carrying little more than the equivalent of $100 from his father, Cesar crossed the border and entered the United States. In later interviews, he described the journey as terrifying, saying there were moments when he genuinely believed he might not make it. If the crossing was difficult, what came next was even harder. Southern California wasn't waiting with opportunity. It greeted him with a language he couldn't speak, almost no money, no professional contacts, and nowhere permanent to live. Millan has spoken about periods of homelessness and surviving by taking whatever work he could find. He cleaned kennels, groomed dogs, walked neighborhood pets, and accepted jobs that many others overlooked. Looking back, he has even joked that some of the dogs under his care lived more comfortably than he did. He did good work, though, and his reputation spread quietly. Instead of marketing himself to owners of well-behaved pets, Millan would accept dogs that other trainers had already given up on. These weren't simple obedience cases. Many had histories of biting, severe anxiety, or destructive behavior that left families feeling hopeless. One successful rehabilitation led to another referral, and before long, his client list began expanding into affluent neighborhoods around Los Angeles. A feature in the Los Angeles Times introduced his work to a much wider audience, marking one of the first times his name reached beyond local word of mouth. It was a turning point. Then came an encounter that neither side could have predicted. Actress Jada Pinkett Smith watched Millan work with dogs and became convinced his abilities belonged on television. According to both of them, she encouraged him to think bigger than private clients, but she also pointed out the obvious challenge. Audiences couldn't connect with someone they struggled to understand. Smith helped him enroll in English lessons, and Millan threw himself into learning the language, later explaining that he intentionally spent less time in Spanish-speaking environments because he believed total immersion was the fastest route to fluency. It was an uncomfortable choice, but one that opened doors he could never have entered otherwise. That preparation paid off at exactly the right moment. In September of 2004, Dog Whisperer with Cesar Millan quietly premiered on the National Geographic Channel. It wasn't launched as a blockbuster, and few industry insiders expected it to become a global sensation. Yet viewers were immediately drawn to its formula. Families on the verge of giving up on beloved pets suddenly watched those same dogs appear calmer within a single episode. Millan's steady demeanor stood in sharp contrast to the frantic households he visited, and his repeated emphasis on calm, assertive energy quickly became one of television's most recognizable catchphrases. The success that followed was extraordinary. His books climbed bestseller lists, international tours filled arenas, and dog owners across the world began adopting his vocabulary and techniques. Then, in August of 2009, Millan officially became a citizen of the United States. This was the top of the ladder, but rapid success has a way of attracting scrutiny. The downfall that no one saw coming. To the public, Cesar Millan seemed almost impossible to rattle. But while television audiences argued over his training methods and newspapers focused on growing controversy, a deeply personal collapse was unfolding behind the screens, and it nearly ended his life. The first crack appeared in February of 2010 with the death of Daddy, Millan's famous American Pit Bull Terrier. Originally rescued by rapper Redman before eventually becoming Cesar's companion, Daddy grew into one of the most recognizable dogs on television. Trainers, celebrities, and longtime fans often described him as unusually balanced, and after reaching the age of 16, he had become inseparable from Millan's public identity. What audiences couldn't fully appreciate was what Daddy meant away from the cameras. The dog had witnessed nearly every stage of Cesar's remarkable journey. Millan later admitted that losing him felt less like saying goodbye to a pet and more like losing a lifelong partner. Speaking of losing lifelong partners, in June of 2010, just 4 months after Daddy's death, Millan's wife, Cesar Millan, filed for divorce, ending a marriage that had lasted 16 years. Together, they had raised 2 sons while building a career that transformed Cesar into an international celebrity. The timing only amplified the emotional impact. Behind the confident television persona, Millan had spiraled into a profound depression. Success offered no protection. Despite achieving worldwide fame, he blamed himself for the collapse of his marriage and became consumed by feelings of failure. Eventually, the emotional weight became overwhelming. In interviews years later, Millan disclosed that he attempted to unalive himself and had to be rescued. The revelation shattered the carefully maintained image of a man who always seemed composed, replacing it with something far more human. His recovery did not happen overnight. Millan has often credited physical exercise as one of the key factors in rebuilding his mental health, explaining that movement helped him regain control when his thoughts felt overwhelming. Dogs also remained central to that process. Returning to rehabilitation work gave structure to his days and reconnected him with the passion that had driven him since childhood. The experience also changed the way he spoke in public. Interviews that had once focused almost entirely on canine behavior gradually expanded to include conversations about grief, resilience, fatherhood, and emotional well-being. But what about the rumors? Was the dog whisperer sentenced to life? Spend just a few minutes searching online, and you'll quickly find sensational headlines claiming Cesar Millan was arrested, sentenced to life in prison, or secretly disappeared after Dog Whisperer ended. These rumors are as fake as things get. But they're even more hurtful coming at a time when Millan has pushed to move past the worst chapter of his life. That gap between reality and internet mythology says something interesting about modern celebrity culture. Once a public figure becomes controversial, almost any rumor can gain traction if it confirms what people already believe. Algorithms reward outrage. By the time corrections appear, the original story has usually traveled much farther. But if anyone expected Millan to quietly disappear after Dog Whisperer, they underestimated his persistence. Rather than waiting for another television opportunity, he began taking his work directly to audiences through Cesar Millan Live. Without editing, dramatic music, or carefully selected camera angles, he worked with shelter dogs and volunteers before thousands of spectators. Supporters argued the live format demonstrated that his techniques weren't simply the product of clever television editing. Critics remained unconvinced, insisting that the underlying scientific questions had never been resolved. Television wasn't finished with him either. In March of 2014, Nat Geo Wild premiered Cesar 911, a series centered on families facing severe behavioral problems with dogs they feared could no longer remain in their homes. The program ran for multiple seasons, an important detail because it directly contradicts another common online myth. If National Geographic had truly severed ties with Millan over controversy, launching another series within the same family of networks would have been difficult to explain. Away from cable television, Millan built a massive online audience through YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, podcasts, and digital training programs. No longer dependent on traditional broadcasting, he could speak directly to millions of followers across the world. His content gradually expanded beyond demonstrations with dogs, exploring topics such as leadership, emotional regulation, and the influence human behavior has on canine behavior. His personal life also began moving in a more hopeful direction. After surviving the devastating period that followed his divorce and battle with depression, Millan found happiness with actress and stylist Jaheira Dar. In April of 2016, he announced their engagement after proposing during a trip to Athens, Greece, overlooking the Acropolis. The announcement represented far more than a relationship milestone. Only a few years earlier, Millan had publicly admitted he had reached one of the darkest moments of his life. Now, his story increasingly reflected recovery rather than survival. Another television chapter followed in July of 2021 with Better Human, Better Dog, produced for National Geographic and Disney's streaming platforms. Even the title hinted at an evolution. Instead of concentrating almost exclusively on changing dogs, the series placed greater emphasis on the emotional state of owners, arguing that stress, inconsistency, and human behavior often shape canine behavior more than people realize. His core belief in calm leadership remained, but many observers noted that the program devoted considerably more attention to psychology and relationships than his earlier work. The arguments surrounding his methods, however, never disappeared. Veterinary behaviorists continue to challenge concepts such as dominance theory, pack leadership, and certain physical correction techniques, pointing instead to reward-based approaches supported by contemporary behavioral research. At the same time, millions of owners continue to credit Millan with helping them better understand their DINs and, in some cases, preventing animals from being surrendered. Whatever your position is regarding his methods, you have to commend his persistence through some of the darkest days of his life. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, you watched. Please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.